In late 2009, around the Christmas break, there was a hazardous development within Google's network. Everyone is aware that Google is among the most well-known websites in the world. Some even go so far as to call it the Internet itself. Founded in the 1990s, this firm boasts the brightest brains working for it. Hacking Google is, to put it mildly, practically impossible. It is the responsibility of Google's whole security team to make sure everything is safe before it is made accessible to consumers. In order to make sure there are no assaults or questionable activity, surveillance teams are also in place around the clock. They have the greatest level of security. The best security measures must be in place for everything. But all their fortifications were outmatched by this strike. The hackers managed to get inside the network, breaking into many systems and dangerously probing deep into Google's servers. They were attempting to get private and sensitive information. Google immediately recognized this behavior and realized that they were dealing with an entirely new type of assault compared to anything they had ever seen. Google was able to swiftly halt the assault and thoroughly sanitize the network after learning about it. But the details won't be overlooked. Google posted an explanation of the events on its official blog on January 12, 2010. They claimed that this attack was unprecedented in its sophistication. None of the security programs identified the virus that was deployed. Hours after Google's disclosure, security software company McAfee acquired a copy of the dangerous application and began researching it. Another business also came forward to report that they were assaulted over the end-of-year holidays. Adobe, the developer of Photoshop, Premiere, and PDF readers, was that business. So, after then, it became quite evident that the problem extended beyond only focusing on Google and Adobe. This hack, it turned out, also affected other firms, including Microsoft, Yahoo, and Rackspace. Google discovered that over 20 businesses were the targets. They were all targeted at the same time, and according to some sources, the number may have reached as high as 200 businesses. Clearly, a huge thing was going on. By examining logs and diving into the malware, the victim companies, cybersecurity organizations, and even law enforcement agencies initiated a thorough investigation. Researchers were able to determine the precise mechanism of the assault. Upon deconstructing the malware, McAfee found that the attackers were operating it from the Aurora folder. The malware in this assault was discovered right there in the Aurora folder. Consequently, the assault was dubbed Operation Aurora by McAfee. So how did the hackers manage to get in then? They would first choose their target, usually an employee of the business they wish to compromise. Ideally, this would be a developer or someone with more network access. They would then look up their details, including phone numbers, email addresses, and the individuals they communicated with. Occasionally, they would even examine the structure and tone of their emails to one another. Next, they would target this individual with a phishing email. Unlike the typical scam emails, like the Nigerian prince's request for assistance with a sizable inheritance, these emails were well-planned and well-written. Quite the sophisticated approach, really. The hackers would create an email that seemed to be from a coworker at work and urge the victim to do something since they knew who the victim spoke to and how the emails between them looked. A developer or someone with more network rights would be preferable. They then look up his details, including his phone numbers, email address, and the individuals he interacts with. They occasionally even examine the structure and tone of the emails they exchange. They then target this individual with a phishing message. The email didn't appear to be a cheap fraud from a Nigerian prince who claimed to have a significant fortune. No, the messages were intelligent and well written. The hackers would create a message that appeared to be from a coworker at work and encourage the victim to click on a certain link since they knew who the victim interacted with and how the emails were formatted. He selects a certain link to click on. Even professionals in cybersecurity might have been tricked by the cleverly written texts. After clicking on the link, the victims would be sent to websites that included this dangerous software. This is where the issue starts. The malicious software would take advantage of an unidentified vulnerability known as a zero-day, even if the user had updated their web browser. This phrase indicates that Microsoft did not address this issue in browser upgrades since they were not aware of it. The malware runs commands on the victim's device when they visit the infected website. The application is carried and installed by these instructions, and it then begins to execute. This is where the intricacy starts. The downloaded malware was so sophisticated that it was a brand new Trojan that was undetectable by security tools and could infiltrate a fully updated version of Windows. This Trojan was extremely intelligent, had robust encryption, and functioned in secret. By establishing a line of communication, the Trojan gave the hackers access to the victim's device. After clicking the link, all of this occurred in a matter of seconds and seemed to be typical network activity. The Trojan is a Trojan Horse virus, a kind of malicious software that frequently poses as an authentic application. These Trojan infections are typically used by hackers to gain access to user computers. As we have covered in several other films, users are frequently tricked by various types of social engineering. They download and install the virus on their computers. These crooks may spy on the victim, steal confidential information, and compromise Google after the Trojan is installed. Social engineering, like we have covered in several other films. They download and install the virus on their computers. Once the Trojan has been launched, these thieves may penetrate Google, steal confidential information, and spy on the victim. Although Google is attacked every day, the majority of these assaults take use of well-known flaws, which you can quickly discover via a blog post or YouTube video. The fact that this assault exploited weaknesses that were entirely unknown made it exceedingly risky. Attacks with zero-day vulnerabilities are uncommon. These vulnerabilities were either developed by a research and development team, or the hackers had a lot of money to purchase them. The quantity of research they conducted on the victims prior to sending them the emails is another concerning aspect. They obviously knew that defenses would be weakened because of the holidays. Therefore, they attacked the victims over the Christmas and New Year's holidays. Now allow me to briefly explain zero-day vulnerabilities. Zero-day vulnerabilities are flaws or faults in systems or software that only hackers are aware of. This indicates that the software's creators, or the firms who made it, haven't found the issue yet and don't have time to repair it. For this reason, it is referred to as a zero-day or day zero. In total secrecy, the hacker takes advantage of the weakness to compromise the system or steal information. Because the system has no defenses against it, it is a surprise assault that creates issues before anybody recognizes its threat. To put it briefly, it's similar to finding a hidden entrance in a friend's house that you enter before the owners have had a chance to shut it. Not everyone was unfamiliar with the sophisticated strategies and tactics employed by the hackers in this attack. Complex assaults like this one are a regular occurrence for governments, and they also affect the banking and public service sectors. Commercial businesses, however, have never experienced such a sophisticated onslaught. The security environment for commercial enterprises was altered by this incident. Google looked at the records in further detail and attempted to follow the attackers' movements and determine their objectives. They found that they were aiming at two distinct targets. Gmail accounts were the first point. The attackers are thought to have been attempting to access the emails of certain people rather than simply everyone. They were concentrating on human rights advocates, particularly those from China. The organization responsible for the attack was obviously very curious in the plans these activists had for the Chinese human rights movement. When Google looked more closely at the accounts, they discovered an oddity. Every account they attempted to hack was connected to court orders, indicating that access to the accounts had previously been required by U.S. law. The attackers were attempting to get access to accounts that were already subject to court orders. Many were perplexed by this. If Chinese human rights campaigners were already the targets of court orders, why would someone attempt to hack their Gmail accounts? It may be an attempt to learn more about the boundaries of government access to Gmail accounts, or a kind of espionage. The attackers were ultimately only able to discover the date of account creation because Google was able to stop them from accessing any emails. The source code for Google was the second item they attempted to obtain. Since the code of Google's software is regarded as intellectual property, the business naturally does not want anybody to access it. Intellectual property, if anybody had this source code, they could create a website to rival Google, but only Google owns it. The code has to be kept in a safe location, which is often in software configuration management systems like IBM Rationale, Microsoft Visual Source Safe, Perforce, Concur, and version systems. Google's code was kept in Perforce, but when investigating the attack, they found several problems with the system. The attackers used a new and unidentified weakness to get access to Google's Perforce servers, knowing exactly where they were. However, it's possible that none of this was significant in the end. The attack. After researching the Perforce system, McAfee concluded that it was essentially insecure. McAfee identified the following systemic problems. First, no administrator approval was required for the creation of a user account. Because passwords were not secured, it was simple to obtain information from the system without authorization. Since all system communications were not encrypted, it was simple to get around authentication. All of the files were also saved in plain text. We don't know how Google set up the system, but it's obvious that it takes a lot of work to secure, and even then, it's not completely safe. Because they were well versed in the Perforce system, the attackers quickly gained access to the system and extracted a few source codes, most likely pertaining to the Chrome browser. Although the impacted firms did not disclose what was taken or accessed, it is believed that the hack specifically targeted their source code. Since sophisticated operations typically come in phases, what transpired may have simply been information collecting for a more significant strike down the road. If an attacker were to get their hands on the code of a corporation like Adobe, which controls all PDF files, they may discover new ways to make malicious PDF applications or files that read PDFs. They introduce malicious new infections that attack other machines. Microsoft released an urgent upgrade for the operating system and browser as soon as the vulnerabilities were identified. To identify assaults, even businesses such as McAfee developed new features and changed their security programs. The fact that several businesses were impacted by the same vulnerability and at the same time is notable. Following the disclosure of the Aurora vulnerability, businesses were able to quickly identify and address these vulnerabilities. This hacking gang was obviously attempting to strike as many targets as they could before the problem was discovered. A team of persons is needed for an operation of this kind, though, including one to create the vulnerability, one to identify attack tactics, and one to carry out the assaults. They carry out these assaults and get to the firm's source code. Very intriguing facts surfaced after this assault, and the malware that was employed in it were examined. The assaults originated at Shanghai Lixin University of Accounting and Finance and Shanghai Jiao Tong University in China. It is well recognized that these two establishments are reputable and authentic. When you get there, you will notice students moving around the campus, and everything appears to be as usual as ever. But is there any relationship between the assaults and the school itself? Is there a secret basement full of hackers and the school is merely a front? Or might the attackers have been utilizing servers within the institution? The situation, which affected hundreds of American companies, was extremely severe and difficult to handle. The FBI and the U.S. government started looking into it right away. The FBI and the U.S. government started looking into it right away. As you are aware, the internet gives attackers a certain amount of anonymity, making it extremely difficult to trace a cyber attack. As time went on, links began to form that connected the incidents. The Chinese human rights advocates' email accounts were the focus of the attacks. The virus included a checksum technique that is exclusive to China, and the attack started at 2 Chinese schools. People began talking about the potential role of China in this assault as a result of all of this. We are extremely concerned about Google's announcement regarding the attack campaign that the company believes is coming from China. whose goal was to gather passwords for Google users' email accounts, said Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State at the time, in response to the American government's ongoing investigation. "We are taking these accusations seriously because they are quite serious." The quote has ended. The situation was taken to a completely new level by certain media outlets. This action may constitute a declaration of war, according to one reporter. "What if the Chinese government or army is involved in this?" said another reporter. "In every way possible, that would be considered an act of hostility. In my opinion, the issue is more akin to espionage than a war declaration, even though it was only information theft." In response to these charges, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs released an official statement declaring that the charge against China is totally unjustifiable. Internet security is a top priority for the Chinese government, which also enforces legal network restrictions and requires users to abide by them when using the internet. Naturally, Google grew increasingly certain that China was responsible for the hack as their research went on. A highly skilled and sophisticated team was undoubtedly needed for an attack of this magnitude and complexity that targeted all of these businesses at once. The professionalism displayed by the gang behind the attack was frightening. They were obviously not amateurs nor even Google's rivals. It was a bigger and riskier business. We must go back 5 years to 2005 in order to comprehend what transpired next. Given the substantial financial backing and broad control over China's internet infrastructure, Google started developing Google.cn, a customized version of Google for China in 2005. China blocks several of the websites we use on a daily basis, including Google.com, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Access to these websites is restricted by the Chinese government. However, Google made the decision to create a local version that would be acceptable in China because it is the most populated country in the world. Google was granted a permit to operate in China after the Chinese government sought it. They created Google.cn and began setting up offices and employing skilled workers from China. However, the permissions were abruptly canceled by the government, and the Google team had to spend 18 months negotiating fresh permits with the government. One of the requirements was that some search results, such as those pertaining to the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, were to be restricted. Google's managers were unhappy with this degree of restriction, but they had to accept the terms as they wanted to gain access to the Chinese market. Millions of individuals began utilizing Google.cn after its official debut in 2007. However, Google was urged by the Chinese government to tighten its filtering of some search phrases during the 2008 Olympics, some of which were quite general. The U.S. Google management were furious, but they consented because they believed the filtering would only last for the Olympics. The censorship, however, continued after the Olympics concluded and expanded to cover more ground, including searches that were sexual in nature or that criticized the Chinese government or leaders. Google management's connection with China soured as a result of their perception that they were aiding in the repression of the Chinese people. Google established a sizable operations room in 2009 to combat the cyber attack. The Chinese government requested that Google tighten its filtering of a number of search phrases, some of which were quite general and wide-ranging. Although Google's American management were furious, they concurred since they believed the filtering would only last for the Olympics. The censorship, however, continued after the Olympics concluded and expanded to cover more ground, including searches that were sexual in nature or that criticized the Chinese government or leaders. Google's relationship with China soured as a result of the manager's perception that they were aiding in the repression of the Chinese people. In order to combat the 2009 cyber attack, Google established a sizable operations room. They made a decision on China after the technological attack. The creator of Google, Sergey Brin, was furious. Chinese human rights advocates were the focus of the attack, and freedom of expression was being suppressed by Chinese censorship. Sergey reminded the managers that Google's slogan is "Don't be evil," and that they were contributing to that evil by supporting China. The board chairman, Eric Schmidt, disagreed with this suggestion. They said that as part of its global operations outside of the United States, they always abide by local laws in the nations in which they do business. In the end, the point stayed with Google for 4 months. The debate ended when the second founder, Larry Page, took Sergey's side. Google made the decision to close Google. Moreover, reroute all traffic to Google.com.hk, which functions in Hong Kong, a jurisdiction with distinct legal regulations from the rest of China. When Google.com became a location where people could search for anything, including the protests that happened in the well-known squares we discussed, this move was extremely important. Given that Google is the biggest website globally and China is the world's largest market, the company's choice was startling. Traffic and profitability were obviously impacted by losing a market this huge, but it also sent a strong message against Chinese censorship regulations. Google workers in China were shocked by the decision. Most workers learned of the news through calls from their co-workers about 6 in the morning, Beijing time. Everyone hurried to the office to get answers, but the management handed them tickets to see the just-released film Avatar and urged them to go. When the staff members came back to work the following day, Sergey was on a video conference with them outlining the circumstances, but the conversation was really heated. The workers believed that Google had abandoned them in the midst of the conflict. China issued a warning last month to avoid using any of Google's websites, including Google.cn and Google.com.hk. Additionally, Google was totally restricted in China at the time. People in China continue to exercise caution and utilize Baidu and other local search engines. Stories saying that the well-known square protests in China are nothing more than myths and nonsense may be found if you search for them. The Aurora incident altered how businesses see outside dangers. The attack's external dangers demonstrated that security issues are not just a problem for governments, and that even for-profit businesses like Google need to be ready for anything. In order to comprehend, or at least attempt to comprehend, the organization behind the Aurora operation, security researchers from organizations such as Symantec, Dell SecureWorks, and CrowdStrike made the decision to investigate it further. Recognize the organization that is responsible. The Druid Group, also known as Sneaky Panda and Bison, was a group of hackers who exploited the Adobe Flash zero-day vulnerability in the Aurora attack. They were responsible for 7 distinct assault operations that caused breaches in several firms over the 3 years after the event. The group's strength and confidence increased over time, allowing them to steal code from corporations such as Google, Adobe, and Microsoft, and create new vulnerabilities based on earlier attacks. The Druid Group was responsible for 4 of the 8 reported breaches that exploited zero-day vulnerabilities in 2011. Four of the zero-day vulnerabilities they exploited were from the Druid Group, which dominated the hacking scene at the time. They were able to predict the peak of vulnerabilities that were going to be found or fixed with remarkable accuracy. When they felt a weakness was about to be revealed, they would assault as many locations as they could at breakneck speed to take advantage of it right up to the last second. They may have had access to debugging tools inside at Google, Microsoft, or even Adobe, or they may have been receiving information from someone within these organizations. After the Aurora operation, the Druid Group modified their original assault strategy. They used watering hole assaults, which entails attacking a well-known website, embedding malicious software, and waiting for visitors to visit and get infected as an alternative to having them click on phishing links. The organization would have complete access to the victim's device once it was infected. They even shifted their goals. Attacking firms such as Adobe, Google, and Microsoft would undoubtedly aid them in discovering new weaknesses, but it was evident that this was not their primary objective. They were going after military firms that provide tanks, weaponry, and aircraft to the U.S. military, including Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin. These businesses educate them on the newest military technology and even provide information about the inventories of the U.S. military. However, the gang seldom ever targets these businesses directly. Instead, they often target suppliers or small businesses that have direct business dealings with large military organizations, as well as the suppliers of those suppliers. If they are successful in breaking into the supply chain, the compromised software will progressively permeate the large corporation as if it were a direct breach. Since small businesses often don't have the same amount of protection as large defense organizations, this approach is simpler and more clever. In summary, the Druid Group was a group of hackers who exploited the Adobe Flash zero-day vulnerability in the Aurora attack. They were able to predict the peak of vulnerabilities that were going to be discovered or fixed with remarkable accuracy, and they targeted defense firms that provided tanks, weaponry, and aircraft to the United States military. Their approach was simpler and more clever, as small businesses often don't have the same level of protection as large defense organizations. The Dark Web Group and Druids Group have been a significant threat to organizations worldwide, with their tactics and strategies being the subject of numerous investigations and research projects. They have been known to exploit vulnerabilities in websites, such as those found on the Amnesty International website, which disseminated information on military matters. These websites are often visited by members of the armed forces or those employed in the defense sector, making it highly beneficial for them to be targeted. The Dark Web Group and Druids Group have also been involved in cyber attacks, with some researchers suggesting that they collaborated for years before being discovered. Their tactics and strategies have been the subject of several studies and research projects, with some studies suggesting that they split up into smaller organizations that were experts in specific assaults, such as espionage or sector infiltration. In 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Barack Obama met to address cyber attacks diplomatically. After having supper together, they agreed to not engage in cyber espionage for commercial purposes and reiterated their concerns about the dangers of cyber attacks on American individuals and enterprises. They decided that neither the Chinese nor the American governments would encourage or carry out any cyber attacks aimed at stealing intellectual property, including trade secrets or other private data. Obama also stated that they would cooperate with other nations to advance international legislation to control conduct in cyberspace. However, the inspector believes that this armistice is worthless, as both nations continue to collect information on one another, and hackers can enter businesses to steal codes or create new weaknesses. The Dark Web Group and Druids Group have been able to gain control of devices and access compromised equipment through various means, including the use of translators, spies, web developers, trainers, labs, and leaders. The collaboration between these groups has led to the development of various strategies and tactics, with some studies suggesting that they may have evolved over time. In conclusion, the Dark Web Group and Druids Group have been a significant threat to organizations worldwide, with their tactics and strategies evolving over time. While the agreement between the two nations has been reaffirmed in 2017, the inspector believes that this armistice is worthless, as both nations continue to collect information on each other and continue to exploit vulnerabilities. For instance, the malware that was discovered in the well-known Windows system cleaner CCleaner is thought to have originated in China. China was able to access Google and Microsoft data as a result of this hack. China may claim that the stolen material was not utilized for commercial reasons, even if it acknowledged its role. The United States and China's ceasefire is only a flimsy agreement that is unlikely to be carried out. Businesses, particularly those working with military contractors or any other sensitive area, should take this as a serious warning now that we know the attack's perpetrators may target commercial sectors. They may attempt to hack you if they are aware that a defense firm is utilizing your product in order to more simply and deftly get access to the defense company. The threats against you are much increased if you take on a defense firm as a client. In order to gather as much information as they can, nations are constantly attempting to hack the governments and military firms of other nations. This is known as the contemporary arms race. The American National Security Agency, or NSA, may choose not to alert Microsoft to a vulnerability they find. Instead, they keep it to themselves. And in order to remain ahead of the game, they could utilize it in a future cyber attack, ahead of the opposition by one step. Today, we see that governments, both foreign and American, do not disclose zero-day vulnerabilities and instead keep them to themselves. Governments have begun to attack one another and even foreign corporations. In our day and age, this has become rather commonplace. Ghosts on the web, cyber warfare, and espionage against espionage have grown commonplace. This is the new battleground, hidden from view until a significant event occurs, mayhem breaks out, or one side chooses to make a portion of the conflict public. I suggest watching these incredible videos. I'll see you with a fresh case next week.